Israel and Hamas have agreed to a ceasefire deal in Gaza, pausing 15 months of fighting that has killed thousands of people and destroyed much of the territory. The three-phase agreement will take effect on Sunday and will initially see the release of 33 hostages held in Gaza and Israel's withdrawal from populated areas in the Strip.
The first phase of the agreement, lasting 42 days, will involve a ceasefire and the withdrawal of Israeli forces to the east, away from the densely populated areas, to positions along the borders in all areas of the Gaza Strip. It will also include the exchange of prisoners and hostages according to a specific mechanism, the exchange of the remains of the deceased, and the return of displaced persons to their homes.
During the next 6 weeks, Israel will negotiate the necessary arrangements to get phase 2, which is a permanent end of the war. Let me say it again, a permanent end of the war. There are a number of details to negotiate to move from phase 1 to phase 2, but the plan says if negotiations take longer than 6 weeks, the ceasefire will continue.
Let's get out to Jerusalem now and speak to Bloomberg's Dan Williams. So putting together all of the details that we've heard about the ceasefire deal, it seems pretty evident, Dan, that the first phase of the deal involves the humanitarian phase, so to speak, the exchange of hostages for prisoners, the release of extra humanitarian assistance into the Gaza Strip. But the big question is how we transition from phase 1 to phase 2, which would imply a more long-term ceasefire and cessation of hostilities.
That's an excellent observation, Jumana. The only deal in place right now is that phase 1 deal. When we discuss phase 2 and phase 3, those are on paper, those are aspirational, but as President Biden said, those still need to be negotiated over. So really those aren't in hand. And in a sense, we may see that this phase 1 proves open-ended, with only 1/3 of the hostages having been released, with a fraction of the Palestinian prisoners that Hamas wants to be released being released, and an ongoing presence of the Israeli military in the Gaza Strip, with all the friction that will arise from that. The big problem here, the rub in moving from phase 1 to phase 2 and 3, is not just what happens with the remaining 2/3 of the hostages for Israel. It's whether Israel will formally relent on its binding, government-approved war goal of seeing Hamas completely destroyed, or at least dismantled, as the governing and military force in the Gaza Strip. I'm not sure Hamas will allow that, will submit to that, unless in the course of that, for future negotiation, Hamas agrees to some sort of power share, voluntarily relinquishing power in the Gaza Strip.
And talk us through how this is being met with back home. Clearly, a lot of elation, many people very happy to see the return of hostages. But there were some within the Israeli government who were against Netanyahu agreeing to this ceasefire deal. Is there any way that the deal could be scuppered when they vote on it later today?
Well, I think reactions will crescendo today when we're expecting Netanyahu to assemble the inner security cabinet and the wider cabinet to vote on this deal. And then traditionally, Israel gives a grace period before implementation to allow the relatives of people killed or wounded by Palestinian prisoners slated for relief, to allow those relatives to submit court motions. So tensions will run high. There will be expressions of opposition, especially, as you noted, from right-wing camps in Israel. This was a very destructive war for Israel. It was certainly destructive in Gaza, but it's worth keeping in mind that the number of Israeli soldiers lost in this war per capita is about 4 times that lost by the United States in Afghanistan and in Iraq over a much longer period. So many Israelis will be wondering if it was worth it if they don't get all the hostages back and if the war goals aren't achieved. There will be relief at the return of hostages. Some of them are expected to come back as soon as Sunday. There will also be some grief because we know, we anticipate that some of those hostages will prove to have died in captivity. Their families will not know that for sure until they see their loved ones coming back in coffins. So that will be definitely a mixed reaction publicly in Israel, which will affect the tenor of the discussion down the line.
The number of Israeli soldiers lost, that ratio that you highlighted, is very noteworthy, Dan. Is there a perception that Israel has come out of this victorious. Has the 15-month war been a success from the Israeli perspective?
I think it depends what lens you put on it. If you swivel the lens and zoom in very close to Gaza alone, if Hamas remains in power, and we will certainly be seeing Hamas victory parades. We already saw one, a small popular show of elation you showed in the video insert. But certainly Israelis will not see that as a victory, given that they were promised the end of Hamas in the Gaza Strip. If you zoom out a bit, this was a regional war in which Israel really shifted the balance entirely all the way to Iran. Hezbollah has been really gutted in Lebanon. That contributed to the fall of the Assad regime. This is a 50-year enemy of Israel. In Syria, Iraqi militias have pretty much stopped firing. Really, the only active firing on Israel has been from the Houthis in Yemen. And while they've done this with technical virtuosity, the distance and the capabilities of Israeli air defenses have really prevented that from causing great damage within Israel. And then there's a big question of Iran. Yeah. Israel has yet to have a showdown with Iran, but it did manage, I think, to humiliate Iran with 2 rounds of fighting in which Israel says it destroyed, for now, the missile-making capabilities of the Iranians and their air defenses, basically leaving them very vulnerable should the question of the Iranian nuclear program come to a head under the Trump administration.